Everybody, welcome to our event entitled South Korea, an inspiration for democracy in Asia. Actually, it should be a question mark at the end because that's what we're going to be debating. My name is Ryota Jonen, and I'm a director of the World Movement for Democracy Secretariat here at NED. The World Movement for Democracy is a global network of democracy activists, human rights defenders, practitioners like members of parliament, scholars and democracy supporters who come together to strengthen global solidarity for democracy and strengthen democracy movements around the world. We do so by facilitating peer-to-peer learning experiences. And I should also mention that this year, and this month in particular, we are celebrating the 20th anniversary of the World Movement. Inspired by the Candlelight Movement that we witnessed in Seoul 2016 and 2017, the World Movement has built a partnership with Korea Foundation and have begun facilitating the exchange of experience and knowledge among the democracy activists, scholars, and practitioners in Korea and the rest of the world on the following topics. How did the Candlelight Movement overcome the general public growing political apathy? What institutions were critical in defending Korea's democracy during the 2016-2017 political crisis? What efforts were made to sustain the interest and the engagement of young people who were mobilized by the movement? And what are the key lessons for other countries' efforts to consolidate democracy? Citizens' movements remain integral elements of democracy. The movements have birthed democratic transitions, pushed governance reforms, and bolstered democratic consolidation. But varying degree of success that different movements have achieved around the world illustrates the challenges facing democracy movements. This beacons the need to explore strategies, challenges, and opportunities the citizens' movements encounter as they seek to consolidate and invigorate democracy worldwide. So today, while our discussion continues to address those questions, we hope that distinguished speakers and guests in this room this morning can also enlighten us to explain how South Korea using their own experiences to play a more robust leadership in inspiring democratic progresses in Asia and beyond. Before I invite Karl Gershman to speak to the stage, I'd like to remind you to kindly silence your mobile phone, and also please use our hashtag WMD events and/or NED events for your social media posting or participating in our discussion through social media. I also like to take this opportunity to thank Korea Foundation, the Embassy of the Republic of Korea, my colleagues at the National Endowment for Democracy, World Movement team, Public Relations team, and the Asia team for making this event happen. So now I'd like to invite Karl Gershman, the President of National Endowment for Democracy, to make his remarks and introduce our opening speaker, Ambassador Kathleen Stephens.
Thank you, Ryota, and welcome to everyone. As Ryota said, our conference this morning focusing on South Korea's role in the development of democracy in Asia and beyond is part of a strategic initiative that the NED has undertaken to encourage greater unity among the world's democracies, and we're very grateful to the Korea Foundation for supporting this conference as well as the work of the World Movement for Democracy. NED's Democratic Unity Initiative is a response to a number of troubling trends that have arisen in global affairs and global politics over the last decade. And these include the rising power and assertiveness of authoritarian countries like China and Russia, the erosion of the rule of law and human rights in many countries that were once stable democracies, and not least a crisis of confidence, unity, and leadership in the world's established democracies that has had the effect of weakening the rules-based world order. It's in this new context, the NED has reached out to democratic organizations, think tanks, policy intellectuals, and others in many democratic countries to encourage them to play a larger role in defending liberal democratic values. We attach a very high priority to strengthening ties with long-established Asian democracies like India and Japan, and South Korea has a special importance as the preeminent third wave Asian democracy that achieved a successful democratic transition following the overthrow of the military government in 1987. Our work to strengthen democratic cooperation with South Korea goes back more than 2 decades. Kim Da-jung was a keynote speaker at an international democracy conference that we held in Washington in 1995 that helped lay the foundation for the creation several years later, Yoda just mentioned the 20th anniversary, of the World Movement for Democracy. And in 1998, we co-hosted with the Korean Council of Civic Movements a major conference in Seoul on civic education and democracy in South Korea. At this conference, Korean NGO leaders, among them Dr. Bong-Scuk, who's with us this morning, called for the funding of civic education programs in South Korea through an arm's length non-governmental entity similar to the National Endowment for Democracy. That meeting was soon followed by the creation of the Democracy Forum for East Asia, which was a joint initiative of the NED and the Sejong Institute that was announced by Presidents Bill Clinton and Kim Da-jung during President Clinton's visit to Korea in November of 1998. The NED is engaged in many other joint initiatives with Korean organizations, most importantly, the 8th Assembly of the World Movement for Democracy in 2015 that was organized in Seoul with the assistance of Dr. Son's Center for Korean Women in Politics, the East Asia Institute, the Korean Democracy Foundation, and the Korean Human Rights Foundation. The Candlelight Revolution, like the June uprising in 1987, has strengthened both South Korea's democracy and its standing in Asia as a democratic country whose political leaders are held accountable by citizens at the grassroots who want their government to be transparent, honest, effective, and accountable. South Korea is thus a model in Asia of democratic performance and accountability. The question before us this morning is whether the influence of South Korea's example should be supplemented by proactive efforts to assist and promote democracy elsewhere in the region. Such efforts undertaken by South Korean civil society would be important at a time when democracy in many Asian countries is being threatened from without by authoritarian forces and from within by corrupt and autocratic practices. Our meeting this morning on South Korea's role in supporting democracy in Asia just happens to coincide with the summit taking place in Vietnam between President Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. We didn't plan it that way, I assure you. But let me take advantage of this coincidence to say a few words about the elephant in the room, which is whether and how to liberalize and help open the totalitarian system across the border in North Korea, something that is not on the agenda, I must say, of today's talks in Vietnam. It's interesting that more than a little ironic that some of the strongest statements supporting the Candlelight Revolution 2 years ago came from the North Korean regime. Nothing, declared Rodong Sin-moon, the mouthpiece of the dictatorship, can stop the South Korean people's righteous fight to drive out the darkness of dictatorship and usher in the dawn of a new democracy. It's not surprising that the regime in Pyongyang would want to highlight protests against the government in Seoul. Significantly, though, and this is relevant to our discussion this morning, the North's propaganda campaign 2 years ago against the government in the South actually backfired. As Daily NK reported, and I think you all know Daily NK, and it has sources on the ground inside North Korea, which is not quite as closed a country as it used to be, the propaganda inadvertently sanctioned discussion in the North about the Candlelight protests. And as a result, it became clear to North Koreans that if tens of thousands of South Koreans were able to protest around the Blue House for 2 months, demanding political change without anyone being arrested or punished, clearly South Koreans enjoyed freedoms that are completely denied to the people in the North. Moreover, while video footage of the protests shown on North Korean television tried to blur the skyscrapers in the background, it could not completely hide the images of prosperity in the South, which contrasts so sharply with the poverty and desolation in the North. The Economist magazine also reported at the time that a North Korean defector who had joined the protests, the Candlelight protests, came away with the understanding that democracy is something that must be fought for. It's very likely that many other North Koreans learned the same lesson. It was not the intention of the Candlelight Movement to influence opinion in North Korea. That was probably the last thing on the minds of the protesters. But it should hardly come as a surprise that a robust example of South Korean democracy, which is what the Candlelight protests were, South Korean democracy in action, would have a stronger impact on Koreans right across the border in the North than on people anywhere else in Asia. Of course, the protests did have an impact elsewhere in Asia as well. And we will talk about that this morning. And as we do, we should also consider the possibility that as South Korean civil society activists begin to share their democratic experience with activists in other Asian countries who are engaged in difficult struggles for democratic accountability and human rights, they will learn from their counterparts and their own horizons will expand. And we don't know if they will eventually develop the capacity and the desire to reach out directly to Koreans in the North who now lack any rights or democratic experience, but if they do, they could bring the divided Korean peninsula closer to genuine peace and reconciliation. Someone who understands the challenges that lie ahead on the peninsula is Ambassador Kathleen Stevens, who was the U.S. Consul General in Belfast, Northern Ireland, during the negotiations culminating in the 1998 Good Friday Agreement, and who later served as the U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Korea on many other assignments, including representing the United States in India. Ambassador Stevens recently spent 3 years at Stanford University. I was just telling her Ned has a very, very close relationship with Stanford, which is probably the leading university in the United States focusing on issues of democracy, where she was the William J. Perry Fellow for Korea, and since September, she's been the president and CEO of the Korea Institute of America. We worked together when she was ambassador in Seoul, and I know that she has a deep understanding of Korean politics and culture, as well as an abiding commitment to finding common paths to reconciliation and democracy in the peninsula. It's my great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Kathleen Stevens.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, President Gershman, for that very generous introduction. I didn't expect you to mention Northern Ireland, but since you did, I actually wrote an op-ed for the Jungang Ilbo, a Korean newspaper, where I tried to draw lessons from the Northern Ireland experience. And I found quickly that translating a lot of the terms of art in a negotiation, like paramilitaries and decommissioning of terrorist weapons, is very hard. But if you read the Jungang Ilbo, you'll see the op-ed. And I do think there's a lot of lessons that we can learn and perhaps even be inspired by from other experiences. But I'm inspired to be with you here today. I'm very honored to join you. Thank you for inviting me. I do want to recognize and also thank the National Endowment for Democracy and President Gershman for his support, not only for this, but many, many initiatives in Asia over the years. My great friends at the Korea Foundation, Min-Jung Kim, the new director of the Korea Foundation, and Ki-ho Jang, the deputy director, are here with us today, and Minister Jun Ho-jun from the Embassy of the Republic of Korea in Washington. So despite everything else happening today, I think this is a very, or maybe especially an important topic, and especially important to have this group here together today. But quite honestly, I don't think you could have kept me away from this event today once I heard about it. It's inspiration for democracy in Asia. South Korea was a great inspiration to me. I witnessed this story. So I'm going to tell you about 3 reasons why really you couldn't keep me waiting here today. And one is a very personal one, and that is I feel like I did witness this story in a very personal way in Korea through the years. Maybe one of the better things about getting older is you see change. And I was first in Korea in the 1970s as a Peace Corps volunteer. Park Chung-hee was the president. My only window on the outside world was a Time magazine that came to me 1 week late once a week with pages torn out and blacked out with black marker because of the censorship. And that's a very, very mild example of the kind of authoritarian atmosphere which prevailed in a Korea that was rising economically. I went back to Korea as a young diplomat in 1983. I spent 6 years there. Turns out if you speak Korean and you're an American diplomat, there's not a whole lot of places where there are more interesting jobs than in Seoul. And I had the most interesting job, I think, in the embassy in Seoul at that time. I was following domestic politics in Korea. And I wasn't spending my time at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I was spending my time talking to students and labor and opposition leaders and all of those who were very eager to see Korea match its economic development with democratic development. And this also included increasingly many, many people, obviously in the rising middle class, from the elites and so on. But it was a very thrilling time. And the achievement, which is often marked, of course, with the June 1987 decision to move to a direct election of the president, is one to which Korea has never looked back. And I think that achievement is equal to the more often highlighted economic rise of South Korea. It was equally hard-fought, equally, I have to say, unexpected. All the smart people said, no, it's too hard to have democracy in Korea. And it wasn't inevitable. I think the U.S. played a role. That's another conversation. But it was clearly the Korean people themselves who made it happen. And again, they've never looked back. So I certainly continue to be inspired, not just by that now historical story, but about the commitment I see in South Koreans to their own democracy. I was actually in Seoul. Once you're in Korea, you kind of never can stay away. In November 2016, I was actually there when we had our presidential election here. And I have to say I was still processing that, shall I say, when I came back from a bike ride outside of Seoul and got dropped off at the South Gate, Namdaemun, for those of you who know Seoul, on a Saturday afternoon. And I had to get out and walk back to my hotel near Gwanghwamun, near the U.S. Embassy there, because the streets were filled with people. But unlike in the 1980s, when I also saw streets filled with people and also filled with pepper gas and rocks and quite a bit of violence, I walked through a crowd of literally tens of thousands of people, of all ages, of all backgrounds, And I stopped and asked many of them, kind of, why are you doing this? I mean, you're going to have an election soon. Why are you doing this? And the young people said to me, this is our moment. We have to show that we are committed to our democracy. So I look forward to the conversation today about the meaning of that. Every democracy is different, but the commitment there is certainly something that I think is reinvigorated and re-inspired not only Koreans, but all of us who believe that democracy is indeed the only system under which we wish to live. Certainly in South Korea, the challenges remain many. Women's rights and issues related to the feminist movement is burgeoning there. Inequality, labor issues, institutional weakness, corruption. That's another thing you always hear in Korea, and I actually just came back about a week ago. A good sign, I think, of the health of Korea's democracy is people complain a lot about what's happening. And shows me again that this is something we can be inspired by and learn from. And second, I just wanted to say I think this is really fitting that this is a joint effort between the National Endowment for Democracy and the Korea Foundation. I hope it's all right if I say the Korea Foundation I first learned about some years ago, and it was actually, as I understand, set up right around the time when Koreans were actually getting passports to be allowed to travel abroad. You know, when I first lived in Korea so many years ago, I knew no one who'd ever been to the United States. I knew no one who'd ever been overseas. Passports were very hard to get. And when the liberalization of travel began with economic and political change, a part of every Korean citizen's passport fee was used to support something called the Korea Foundation, and the Korea Foundation was then used to support efforts to make Korea better understood and known in the world. I thought this was a great idea. I've suggested this to every American policymaker I've ever met, and we've never done it, but I always thought that was a great use and a great commitment on the part, again, of Korean citizens to the notion of making Korea better known to the world as they take their rightful place in it. And also, I guess going back to the 1980s, I know the National Endowment for Democracy was established during the Reagan administration in the 1980s. That was when I was in Seoul covering this burgeoning political scene there. And, one of the things about being at the U.S. Embassy in Seoul in the 1980s, we had lots and lots of visitors, congressmen, lots of administration visitors. And one day, as I was a relatively junior officer, but I spoke Korean, I was given the assignment to help out and accompany a group that came from an organization I'd never heard of called the National Democratic Institute. And we spent several days going around, seeing all the political leaders, talking to people, and so on. And what was really striking to me, and I knew they were associated with the Democratic Party, is that they were very much consonant with what the Reagan administration was doing there, which was trying to support human rights. The first thing I ever did on a computer was make a list of political prisoners in South Korea. Human rights was very much on the agenda, torture, political participation. So I remember that group very well, and I also remember the person who led it. It was a Georgetown professor. You may have heard of her. Her name was Madeleine Albright. And in those several days in Korea, I really, again, got a sense of how the United States, when we can speak in a bipartisan way, as we've been able to do in the past about issues like human rights, issues like democratization, we can support in a constructive way what's going on. Later, much later, as ambassador in Korea, I got to know the work of the IRI, the International Republican Institute, as it worked with North Korean refugees, defectors, trying to make new lives in South Korea. And in particular, I remember the work they were doing with many women there who had come from very difficult passages through North Korea to the South. And I was inspired by that work. So that was my introduction many years ago to the work of the National Endowment for Democracy. And finally, my third point, I guess, is really connected with what we're going to talk about today, and that is Korea's commitment, symbolized by this today, to share its democratic experience as well as its economic development experience. Again, that's a more obvious thing to share, but to share its political, democratic experience, warts and all, problems and all, I guess, with others. I would say including the United States. I think we can learn something from Korea, too. But certainly in the region, there's much to do. And I want to give one example, and I know we'll hear more, where I think that South Korea has done something quite impressive, which is already having results. They have a program under their international development arm of KOICA of sending volunteers to other countries. who bring with them hopefully some expertise and some help and values as well. Koreans explicitly, to me, say, this is our Peace Corps program. Well, as a former volunteer to Korea, as a former Peace Corps volunteer, it inspires me and moves me to think that Korea, at least up until now, is the only country that has ever received Peace Corps volunteers. That program ended in the 1980s, that now has its own version of Peace Corps and going abroad. So I think this final point, and really overall the point I'd like to make, is about values. I think this is much of what underlies this conference. And I know that in this world of talking about a return to great power competition, America first, challenges to democracies throughout the world, sometimes this notion of values and where that fits in gets a little bit lost. But I'm going to kind of leave you with a small Korean lesson. I don't speak very good Korean, but for those of you who don't know much Korean, I find the young people now learn most of their Korean through K-pop. And oh, by the way, that's another point I wanted to make. Without democracy, there would be no Korean wave. You can argue with me about that. I'm absolutely convinced of that. So if you like K-pop or not, it just wouldn't happen. It doesn't come from a country that doesn't have the sort of freedom of expression that South Korea does now. So here's my, in sort of U.S.-Korea alliance over the years, Koreans and Americans often will say, let's go together. So in Korean, that's 같이 갑시다. 같이 means together. And I was thinking the other day that, there's the word in Korean for values sounds the same. Forgive my pronunciation. It's 같이. So I've revised the 같이 갑시다 to say 같이 바탕으로 같이 갑시다. On the basis of our shared values, 같은 가치로. On the basis of our shared values, we need to go forward together. So I welcome this conference. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Ambassador Stephens, for such insightful remarks. Really, I can hear your love for Korea, but I think the last point that you made about shared value is something that we like to see South Korea playing a role in sharing the value through Asia. But before we start talking about the role of South Korea in Asia, we'd like to take a moment to start thinking about what actually happened during the Candlelight Movement and what impact it made into society and the political institutions. So the first session this morning will focus on that. And then later session will talk about how that experience can be translated into the rest of the region. So I'd like to invite this morning's speaker, Professor Juk-Jin Chan and Dr. Son. And this session will be moderated by Dr. Jisoo Kim. I believe that all the presenters have a PowerPoint presentation. So I'd like to invite Dr. Chan to come up here to make a presentation, and then followed by Dr. Son. And everyone come to the stage to have moderated conversation. Thank you so much.
Use this one.
Well, good morning. I'm Dr. Jin Chang from Seoul National University. I feel very much privileged to have this opportunity to share my ideas about candlelight protests and its impact on Korean democracy. I'd like to express my deep thanks to the NED who made this happen, and also the Korea Foundation for supporting this wonderful event. Today, I would like to show you basically the making of a specific type of citizens in Korea. Like the title shows, the making of candlelight citizens, a specific type of citizens, candlelight citizens. The argument is basically this. Three things. One is social movements such as candlelight protests can be properly understood from micro to macro history perspective, by which I mean the making of collective agency, such as Candlelight Citizens and collective mission, what those in the newly formed type of citizens are supposed to do through the movement and after the movement. The second argument is Moon Jae-in government has made significant progress in many areas of Korean democracy. And the third argument is, despite all that, tensions still remain, which is fundamentally related with the achievements and limitations of candlelight protests. Two things. One is effective power to govern with regard to challenges from outside, and horizontal accountability with regard to challenges from inside. Okay. That's basically my argument this morning. Actually, I was allowed 20 minutes for this talk, and this morning I test ran this presentation and it took 23 minutes. So I need to cut 3 minutes. So let me go very fast for the next two parts of my talk to save time. The significance of candles, and like we all know, after the candlelight protest and after the launching of the Moon Jae-in government, candles have become a very significant symbol for democracy in Korea. So I wanted to show you some examples, but I need to go very fast. By the way, it doesn't work. Okay, all right. The official government documents mention candles, and what's even more interesting is in his acceptance speech of the Global Citizen Award by Atlantic Council 2 years ago, President Moon Jae-in also mentioned that he is, for example, a president born by the Candlelight Revolution, and his government was launched with the mission given by the Candlelight citizens to advance the spirit of candles. Okay? This is how significant candles are currently in Korea. And also, there are many art pieces being generated about candles, one of which was hung on the wall of the Blue House, this one, okay, which depicts the candlelight protest in Gwanghwamun Square. There are many other art pieces being generated, one of which is this. How beautiful it is. This one is actually painted by one of our panelists this morning, Dr. Bong-Scuk. Yeah, she's a very well-known political scientist and an activist, and at the same time, she's a rising star in Korean art scene as well. Okay. So the theoretical resources on my analytical strategy is to actually combine three different lines of literature in the social sciences. One is the literature about defective democracies. Actually, the literature on defective democracies first started with this paper, Delegative Democracy by O'Donnell in 1994, 25 years ago. This paper happened to be published in the journal you know very well, the Journal of Democracy. Yeah. This is the NET journal. Okay, so I thought it's a very interesting coincidence that I'm talking about delegative democracy and defective democracies at NET, the discussion about which first started in the NET journal. Okay, the second line of literature is about collective identity and social movement, and the third line of literature is the analysis of unstructured big data in the social sciences. So combining these three, literature on defective democracy provides multidimensional criteria for democracies so that we can evaluate what happened in Korea through and after the candlelight protests. And the literature on collective identity clarifies the collective agency and the mission of this agency. And this unstructured big data makes it possible for us to understand candlelight protests from the scratch, from the bottom, from what people really felt and expressed, wrote about their experiences in candlelight protests. So what I did is basically this. The analysis is the candlelight protest first started in October 24th, 25th in 2016. And then it lasted for 24 weeks until the presidential election. Okay? And Korean people, many of them wrote tweets on Twitter about candlelight protests. So I collected all the tweets and then analyzed what they said in these tweets. Slightly over 30,000 tweets. So this is how many tweets there were week by week, and we can periodize this into, divide this into three different periods. Period one is from the beginning until the passing of the impeachment bill at the National Assembly, and the second period is from the bill passing until the Constitutional Court confirmation of the impeachment, and the third period is from the confirmation until the presidential election. This is the most frequently mentioned words, but let me skip this part because I think most of you do not read Korean anyway. So candlelight citizens, the agency, the collective identity. So what is candlelight citizens? Like many of you know, there were a lot of worries about Korean democracy because of the absence of citizens, which have to be the grassroots of democracy. If you look at the trends of the words mentioned on Twitter during this 24-week period, as you can see, citizens, in the first week, citizens were mentioned a lot of times, and then it drops and remains stable. And there is this tendency that another collective identity, another type of agency is constantly on the rise, which is candlelight citizens. Once again, this is citizens, remains pretty flat. This is candlelight citizens on the constant rise. And what is the mission? 적폐청산 has become the mission of candlelight citizens, LAE. For those of you who do not understand Korean language, 적폐청산 or LAE is a combination of two words. One is 적폐, meaning accumulated evil. Okay. 청산 meaning liquidation. So combining these two, 적폐청산 means liquidation of accumulated evil. That became the mission of the candlelight citizens. Let me show you this relative frequency of 적폐, accumulated evil, during the 24-week period. In the beginning, there was no mention about 적폐 at all. And as the candlelight protest unfolds, it goes up and up and up, and especially it explodes during the 3 or 4 weeks toward the end of the presidential election. Okay? So that means the mission had not been there from the beginning. It was formed during the candlelight protest. Okay? Once again, this is the absolute frequency of words connected with 적폐, accumulated evil. If we use the 3 periods division, during the first period, there was virtually no words connected to accumulated evil. In the second period, a few words come up. In the third period, then it explodes. Okay? During the second period, the most frequently connected word to accumulated evil is, of course, liquidation, and then 박근혜, and then impeachment, and then resignation. In the third period, once again, liquidation, coalition, 문재인, 박근혜, and people. So the story goes like this. In the beginning, there was nothing about accumulated evil. In the second period, 박근혜 was the only accumulated evil. In the third period, there is this confrontation between 2 different camps. On the one side, there is 문재인 together with the people. On the other side, there is 박근혜 plus evil coalition. Okay. This is how the story was formed during the candlelight protest. So underneath these frequencies, what were the structure and trend of this course? For this, I used a methodology called structural topic modeling, but I don't want to explain the technical details here because it's not an academic conference. Basically what it does is this. When there are such big documents, such as 30,000 tweets, it is impossible for humans to read and understand what they're saying. So the methodology basically makes it possible for us to have the computer read those documents on behalf of us and come up with what kind of topics there are and how they are related with one another. Okay? That's basically what it does. And it comes out that there are 59 different topics on Twitter. In tweets, people tweeted about candlelight protests, and many of the topics are related. So in this figure, links, the lines, denote positive correlations. Positive correlations among topics are a very interesting phenomenon because topics compete for space. So if there is a big proportion of one topic, then there is very little space left for the other topics. So naturally enough, the correlations among different topics are supposed to be negative. So if you see a positive correlation, that means these two topics are very, very closely related. So if you mention this, then you have to mention that, right? So the lines show the positive correlations. And if you run a cluster analysis on this, then there are 5 different topic clusters. So 59 detailed topics clustered into 5 bigger topics. Okay. This is the first topic cluster, which is criticisms about existing establishment. So everything that is establishment is criticized. Pressure to pass impeachment bill and uphold impeachment decision, resignation of Park Geun-hye, criticisms about Saenuri party and pro-Park politicians, and there is this equation that dictatorship is equal to pro-colonialism is equal to Park Geun-hye. And virtually all politicians are being criticized. And Mr. Ban Ki-moon, who was the former Secretary General of the United Nations, was also criticized. Lee Jae-yong, the chairperson of the biggest Korean conglomerate, Samsung, was criticized now, etc., etc. Topic cluster 2, meaning building or meaning bestowing of candlelight protests. Now, people need to come up with the meaning of what they are doing. So an important part of this is nonviolence. Nonviolence as a coin of mature democracy. And another thing is square democracy. We are achieving democracy in this square. And candlelight revolution, hope and emotion for a new world, and comments about fairy sewer and other agenda. Topic cluster 3 is candlelight protest, CLP, news and mobilization. There are this and this type of news and information about on what day, what time we will gather for the candlelight protests, things like that. And topic cluster 4, collective identity formation and labeling. So this is composed of subtopics such as mostly positive opinions about CLP participants and left-right labeling. This collective identity is not just formed by the participants themselves. It is also formed by labeling their opponents, their enemies. So candlelight protest participants, they label the so-called 태극기부대, pro-Park demonstrators as rightists, ultra-rightists. And they criticize the CLP participants as leftists or pro-North. And that's part of how collective identity was formed. And criticism and discontent about news coverage and the pro-Park demonstrators' argument that pro-Park demonstrators are patriots, things like that. And topic cluster 5, regime change and presidential election. Okay. I'm sorry. This is the relative frequency of 5 topic clusters in all related tweets. And let me show you the temporal dimension, how these topics changed during the 24 weeks. This is how the topics changed. Okay. So the green line shows the mobilization. But as we all know, the candlelight protest was an instant success. Okay. So the need for mobilization quickly decreases, as you can see. Okay. And the red line shows the established criticisms about the establishment. So like you can see, the establishment criticism constantly goes on. And the blue line shows collective identity formation. And as you can see, it's constantly on the rise. And there are two momentums. As you can see, there's a big jump here, and there's another jump there. Okay. Those two momentums are bill passing and court confirmation. Okay. And the topic 4, this greenish line, shows meaning bestowing. And it quickly goes up as collective identity formation is completed. Like you can see, it goes up and down like this, and it quickly goes up because the identity formation is completed. Now that they know who they are, and they know what to do. Okay. And the 5th purple line shows election and regime change. And it suddenly goes up toward the end of the candlelight protests. So as the election nears, it begins to dominate the discourse. So with this kind of analysis results, how can we evaluate the changes in Korean democracy before and after the candlelight protests? Let's go back to the literature on defective democracies. This is slightly modified from the original argument by Wolfgang Merkel. His argument is basically this. The most frequently said, the most central part of democracy is, of course, the electoral regime. But even if you have a democratic electoral regime, it does not necessarily mean that you have a good working, well-working democracy. It has to be embedded in different elements of democracy, 4 different elements: civil rights, political liberties, effective power to govern, horizontal accountability. So if the civil rights is flawed, then you have an exclusive democracy. If the political liberties are flawed, then you have an illiberal democracy. If your effective power to govern is flawed, then you have a tutelary democracy. If you have your horizontal accountability flawed, then you have a delegative democracy. This is basically the framework, and the Korean achievement, Korea's achievement back in 1987 was basically the achievement at the Senate electoral regime. We recovered direct election of the president. That was the achievement in 1987. But after that, especially during the two governments, two conservative governments, Imeongbak government and Park Geun-hye government, we saw a lot of retreat, a setback in democracy. So during those two regimes, what happened? Almost all areas of democracy was flawed. Electoral regime itself was flawed because there was this scandal about rigged election, and the civil rights also was also flawed because the illegal investigation of civilians. Political liberties was also flawed because freedom of expression was very much constrained, and horizontal accountability was flawed. But this is not the problem of only those two conservative governments. It's a chronic problem with Korean democracy. And the effective power to govern was flawed, as we all saw from the Choi Soon-sil scandal. Okay. So after the inauguration of Moon Jae-in government, what kind of progress was made? It looks like we have a lot of progress in those 3 blue areas: electoral regime, civil rights, and political liberties. But there are 2 remaining areas where we still see some tension. One is the effective power to govern. There are examples such as this ongoing controversy over income-led growth policy. Okay. There is constant criticism or attack from the conservative faction of the society, conservative press, for example, or the Conservative Party, sometimes distorting facts. So how to fight against this challenges from outside is an important problem. And the other thing that is a problematic area is this horizontal accountability. Despite all this progress, there is still this very strong criticism about Moon Jae-in government. There is, for example, a very well-known book written by a famous political scientist whose name is Park Sang-hoon. The title of the book is Blue House Government. So with all these good intentions, Blue House looks like doing everything, which is not supposed to be very much democratic. So these two areas, we still can see democratic tensions in Korea, despite the progress made by the candlelight protest. So this brings to the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
Can I turn it on? Turn it on?
If you close it, it'll turn off. PowerPoint? Here's this.
Good morning. This is Bong-Scuk son. I was given only 15 minutes for my presentation. So to save the time, I will read rapidly what I prepared. The Candlelight Movement, calling for the impeachment and the resignation of then-President Park Geun-hye, began on October 29, 2016, and continued every Saturday evening until March 11, 2017. In the form of protest rallies. It began on the Gwanghwamun Square in Seoul, but soon spread to other parts of the country, from major cities like Busan, Gwangju, and Daegu to small towns in the countryside. I would like to share my personal experience with the Candlelight Movement with you. There were 20 Saturday night consecutive rallies in total. I attended 16 of them. Luckily, at that time, I had been living only about 100 meters away from the Gwanghwamun Square, where the rallies were being held. On the first day of the candlelight vigil, my husband and I headed out to the square in anticipation. It was still early in the evening, but a huge crowd had already gathered. Our interest was piqued. As my husband and I are both political scientists, our interest was so not merely as participants, but as observers. As a civic activist myself, mine was even more intense. Moving through the crowd, I was already an active participant in the protest rally, as well as a cool-headed observer. What surprised me wasn't the sheer number of participants, or even the fact that the countless candles looked almost beautiful and romantic. It was the fact that I saw joy and pride in the facial expressions and body movements of every single participant. The positive energy emanating from the wide spectrum of people who were there, of their own volition, was so contagious that it was spreading from one person to the next in a natural wave. from children to middle and high school students in uniforms, from young to middle-aged people, from mothers with baby strollers to mothers holding the hands of their small children, and senior citizens in their 60s and 70s. It was obvious the crowd comprised all generations of people from all walks of life. Their faces showed pride in the fact that they could do something to change the fate of the nation. One of their popular slogans was, "How is this a country?" Korean citizens were out to show that they would not tolerate an incompetent, corrupt, and unjust government any longer. Their sense of responsibility manifested itself in the Candlelight Movement. Millions of people were thankful for and proud of one another for braving the cold, dark winter nights on the square together. The protest rallies were friendly, orderly, and peaceful. I could not help but be amazed at how much Korea's civic society had matured. It had been about 30 years since the 1987 pro-democracy uprising, since which time civic activism had continued to expand and civic awareness grow. Until the mid-1980s, civic activism existed outside the system in the form of resistance. But since the 1990s, it has found a place within the system, proposing policy alternatives, spearheading social changes, and solidifying its position along the way. Over the past 3 decades, civic activism has become well organized around various political, social, economic, and cultural issues found in the voice of individual organizations in normal times, but bringing the civic society together as a whole in times of need. The political system of local autonomy, which had been restored in the early 1990s, also contributed to promoting people's interest in everyday politics. As such, the Candlelight Movement should not be viewed as the fruit of labor by any one particular organization. It would be fair to see it as a culmination of capacity-building efforts by the entire Korean civic society over the past 30 years. The 20 Candlelight Rallies held all around the country are estimated to have attracted over 15 million participants. The record-breaking mass rallies were held without a single instance of a physical clash, strictly abiding by the law and creating a protest culture of nonviolence and peace. They were even combined with the cultural elements to become large-scale cultural festivals, featuring millions elements to become large-scale cultural festivals, featuring millions of candles, which left no room for violence. After the first rally was held, about 1,500 civic groups from around the country founded a coalition called Emergency Action for Park Geun-hye's Resignation on November 9, 2016, as they felt the need to organize their response and action. It was this group that came up with the slogans and planned cultural events for the rallies every week. Their finance records show they managed to collect 3.9 billion won, about $3.5 million, over the entire protest period. Actually, I caught a cold. Mouth is so dried up. Over 1.8 billion won was collected in boxes that were passed from one person to the next on site. The other 2 billion won came through online donations. Under previous military dictatorships, many Koreans had been paid money to attend the state-organized protest, into creating a huge many Koreans, just 1 second, to attend the state-organized protest or vote in favor of the government. But now, they were not only attending the protest willingly, but also paying their own money into creating huge fund against a corrupt government. After each rally, people cleaned up after themselves. By morning, there was nothing left at the site of rallies to suggest that there had been 1 million people gathered there the night before. This was covered by news outlets worldwide and became another source of pride of Koreans. It goes without saying that although the Candlelight Rallies were held in a legal, peaceful, nonviolent, and almost festival-like manner, the message they were sending was serious: to impeach Park Geun-hye and hold her accountable for a grave abuse of power. Under the slogan, "How is this a country?" they carried a stern message that a president who failed her country should respond to the public's call for resignation. It should also be noted that the protest might not have stayed peaceful had the police intervened with force, as they had in the past in defense of the government in power. It could be said that even the police acknowledged the incompetence of the Park Geun-hye administration, as well as the right of the people to speak out. Since the Candlelight Movement, people's interest in politics has grown a great deal, and younger people have become more involved. Since the April 19 revolution in 1960, high school students had no time for political interest, as they had to struggle with rigid academic regulations and overly competitive college entrance exams. And young people in their 20s had never experienced such large-scale political demonstration. I would like to share my thoughts and observations from the viewpoint of a political scientist. By participating in the Candlelight Movement, younger Koreans have experienced the ways of civil politics and direct democracy, as well as their political efficacy. Seeing their demand and participation lead to the impeachment of the president has probably given them a greater sense of achievement and self-efficacy. In highly developed information societies like Korea, young people are very savvy with the online media. They have access to a wide range of political information through web portals and YouTube channels. They have begun to engage in political discourse online and voice their political views on social media. Politicians are experimenting with various methods to attract the attention of young voters. And there is growing talk of lowering the voting age from 19 to 18. In the case of local councils, we see an increasing number of young people wanting to become politicians. I believe the Candlelight Movement has given people a greater awareness and confidence to stand up against political injustice. They know, and the political circles know, that they can rise again whenever they feel the need to speak out against the government or specific policies. The Gwanghwamun scales remembers what millions of Koreans think of a proper country is. At the foundation of Korea is an ever-maturing civil society and political social awareness. After the Candlelight Movement, Koreans elected Moon Jae-in administration, whose success or failure should not be linked with the success or failure of the Candlelight Movement. The purpose, process, and outcome of the Candlelight Movement will continue to be the driving force of democracy and political development in Korea. I believe the lessons learned from this movement will have a lasting impact beyond Korea for Asia and other fledgling democracies in the world. This protest culture can be adopted in times of a political crisis anywhere as a way to overcome the limitations of representative democracy and to complement it with participatory or direct democracy. The connection between the Candlelight Movement and women's political participation is a personal challenge for me. I established the Center for Korean Women and Politics in 1990, and next year is its 30th anniversary. The campaign for women's political activism has taken a step back as a result of the impeachment of Korea's first female president, Park Geun-hye. I had thought we were making progress as long as the number of women in politics was increasing. But the failure and impeachment of the long-awaited female president was a huge blow and disappointment to the women's movement. Many observers say it may be a long while before we can expect another female president. But I would like to point out that Park Geun-hye was elected more because she was a daughter of former President Park Chung-hee than because she was a woman. On that note, I want to stay optimistic that a future election of a truly competent female president would not be totally out of the question. The Moon Jae-in administration has inherited the demands of the Candlelight Movement. It is burdened with responding to the many groups who led the protest movement, including women's groups, for whom the candles are still burning strong. Their first demand is a constitutional revision to guarantee complete gender equality across all articles of the Constitution. But amending the Constitution is not an easy process in any country. The second demand is for women to be equally represented as men, especially in elected posts and public appointments. But due to time constraints, I will leave the topic of women's political participation to Dr. Lee Jin-oh. She's a panelist in our next session. For more information on this matter, please refer to Kim Un-ju's paper, which is presented at the WMD Seoul event. It calls Women's Candlelight Revolution is not over yet. Thank you.
I would like to first introduce myself. My name is Jisoo Kim. I'm a director of the GW Institute for Korean Studies and also Korea Foundation Associate Professor of History, International Affairs, and East Asian Languages and Literatures. I thought we only have 10 minutes for Q&A, but we were given generous time until 11:20, so I think we'll have enough time for Q&A session. Okay. So, well, I would like to first echo thanking NED and Korea Foundation for making this event possible. I mean, as Ambassador Stevens mentioned, I think I would not have, I could not imagine myself being elsewhere this morning if I were not invited to be the moderator. I think I would be sitting down as one of the audiences. And I would like to begin by thanking both of our speakers, Professor Chang for offering his insightful views and also and arguments, and also Dr. San for sharing her experiences about the Candlelight Movement. Well, before I open up the floor for Q&A, I would just like to make one comment as a moderator, and that is, I think I would like to, one thing that that was not brought up in both of your talk was about the divide. I mean, one of the beauties of democracy is to have diverse views. And I think we witnessed that, we noticed that during this Candlelight movement. There was, although the majority of the population supported was protesting against against Park Geun-hye, but still there are also supporters of Park Geun-hye. And I think that is, in somewhat, I mean, it is healthy to see that kind of diverse views. But I think, one thing that I was curious as I was listening to both of you was what you thought about, because now I think that kind of divide in South Korean society, of course, this schism goes further way back to its history. But I think, even with this Moon Jae-in government, I think that divide is becoming even stronger and stronger. And so, do you see that as healthy or dangerous? Maybe that's something that I would like to open up this discussion, and then I think we'll open up for a Q&A. Any thoughts?
Well, can you hear me? Okay. Thank you for coming up with that interesting question. Because I had this very interesting experience during the Candlelight protest. Like Professor Kim said, there were two. Okay, is it better now? Okay. Just like Professor Kim said, there were two different groups of demonstrators. One is, as we all know, the Candlelight protest, and the other one is it was called the 태극기 부대, National Flag Army in Korean. They were protesting in favor of Park Geun-hye. And I had this good experience to interview these two groups of people. And when I visited in front of the City Hall of Seoul, there was this, it was like a base camp of this pro-Park Geun-hye demonstrators. And they were very old people, mostly very old people. And I asked, in the beginning, they very much suspected me. They were kind of hostile to me. And there was a small tent in which there were portraits of deceased soldiers in Cheonanham, which was a confrontation with North Korea a few years ago. And they kind of wanted me to pay my respect to those deceased. And there was no reason for me not to pay respect for those deceased. So I did that, and suddenly their attitude changed. And they now admitted that, oh, this is a man who is worth talking to. and they told me a lot about their attitude. About their thinking. And so I asked them, why do you come to this place? Some of them coming from a very far away places every Saturday. So, in this old age, and why do you come here regularly? And their answer was, I have the duty to leave this country as a democratic and wealthy country to the generations to come. That's why I come here. And then I moved to the candlelight protest in Gwanghwamun Square. And I asked them a lot of questions, and to many of them, I told this story. I just interviewed these people in the pro-Bakune demonstrators, and they say, no, we are here because we have the duty to leave this country as a democratic and wealthy country. And the answer from the CLP participants was exactly the same. We are here for exactly the same reason. So I think whether this is, before we can say whether this is healthy or dangerous or not, or something else, one thing I can say is that this Korean society has gone through such a fast change. So even though we are living in the same society, the idea of democracy, the idea of a good society is very different across different generations. That's why these things happen. Yeah, that was my experience.
Thank you.
Well, I didn't mention about the division of force camp. I concentrated on the Candlelight Movement. And of course, we do have two major, we have two major political parties, as you know. So there are always different, they are based in different ideology, different policies, different even regional bases, and different supporting groups. So it was like this. It will be continued in the future. Under the democratic, political regime, there's no single issues or single, groups to support the government. It's very natural, a phenomena. That's what I'm thinking.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I guess I will now open up for a Q&A. So if you could identify yourself before asking your question. Okay, that gentleman over there, I think, raised his hand first.
Thank you. Yeon-ho Kim, non-resident fellow at KEI. I think there were two major factors that sparked candlelight protest. The one is Choi Soon-sil scandal, and the other one was Ferry Sewol, the incident. And I'd like to focus on the Sewol whole thing. It became, I think, more and more non-partisan issue because of two things. One was the Pope Francis' visit to Korea. He personally met with the families of the victims and supported them. And the second was so-called Sewol generation, the young students, middle and high schoolers who had empathy with their fellow students who were drained in the instant. So my question is, how important this so-called Sewol generation do you think in terms of the long-term development of Korean democracy? Thank you.
I don't think I can say there is a Sewol generation separately. I know they suffered a lot through that case, the accident, I mean. But the young generation in our country are very much not interested in political affairs and political apathy, maybe I can say. But it's changing rapidly. I can see after the, especially Candlelight Movement, I can see many young people pay attention on political affairs because they have more dialogue on the SNS Professor Zhang researched on the Twitters. So they are very active in that kind of the media. So they are more keen about what's going on. I will say in this way, political is personal. They now recognize small stuffs, what is related to their daily life, is deeply related to the political decision of policies. I think that they recognize these days. So even the small political policies, they start to respond to the policies, which is affect to their daily life. So it's changing. Even those older generations, I don't think they do really different from the ordinary young people. I don't know. It's the exact answer to your question or not.
Would you like to add something?
Well, I can say very briefly, there can be this generation effect, but the other thing that is related to this is this gender gap. By gender gap, I mean the differences in political opinions and attitudes is becoming very big in Korea since about 2 years ago, and especially in the younger generation, in their 20s. Okay, so now the difference in political attitudes in the 20s is bigger than the regionalism difference. Okay, so although on the one hand there is no generation, there may be this generation effect. On the other hand, because of this gender gap, women tend to be sympathetic about this unfortunate disaster that happened to other people. And men in their 20s, they are becoming kind of ultra-conservative. So these two phenomena being mixed together, what kind of long-term effect it will have, I don't know. It's very hard to predict because the two things are compounded.
Okay, next question. I think you raised her hand first.
Hi, my name is Tan Bisa, and I'm from ASEAN Young Fellow. I know there are a lot of people actively participated in the Candlelight Movement, but there was one group in Korea who can't. There are teachers, because though there are most of the OECD countries allows the political freedom for teachers, though in Korea, as political party law prescribe teachers' participation in any of political actions, both as an individual and also as a group, it's illegal. So, as a result, in 2009, some teachers who participated in the declaration of the state of affairs, they were verdicted as guilty. So there are still people who think that teachers' political freedom has to be regulated to keep their students in politically neutral. So I'm wondering of your opinions about the regulation. Still, there is a law which restricts the freedom of political participation in Korea. So, thank you.
선생님들 정치 참여, 정당 가입 이런 거에 선생님 시민사회 경험이 많으시니까 선생님 답하시는 게 좋을 것 같아요.
준비 안 됐는데.
그냥 간단하게 말씀해 주시죠.
그 문제의 핵심이 뭐죠 지금?
한국에서 다른 집단은 안 그런데 교사에 대해서는 정치 참여 권리가 제한되는 거에 대해서 어떻게 생각하세요?
I think even the teachers or professors are permitted, and from the under the high school, should be allowed to participate in political parties or either any kind of political, activities. It's not fair to the right of people. So it should be, permitted.
Okay, Andrew.
Hi, Andrew Yo, associate professor at Catholic University. I was wondering to what extent income inequality is a factor in looking at limitations in South Korean democracy, because we hear about a growing socioeconomic gap in South Korea. And specifically, I was curious if there's any data with, I guess, the younger generation who are wealthy, what their views are, where they fall along kind of the left-right perspective spectrum. Thank you.
말씀하세요. 부의 대물림 같은.
Okay, when it comes to income inequality, I don't know, my answer may be too academic for a conference like this. One thing that is interesting about Korean income inequality and the relationship between income inequality and democracy is that I'm pretty sure that you are familiar with the world values line of research. And what's interesting about the Korean case, actually Korea is the only exception in this in the global trend. The relationship is as the economy grows, people's value system changes in a very systematic, very predictable way. And one thing that is very important in terms of democracy is people's value has to change from materialist to post-materialist, which is a micro-foundation of democracy. Korea is the only exception in this trend. Although the Korean economy has grown compared to the year I was born, nominally it has grown over 300 times. But this value almost hasn't changed at all. Okay? Then why does this value system not change? This value system, which is a micro-foundation of democracy, not change in Korea. Part of it is because of this income inequality. People, although the economy itself has grown a lot, people kind of feel unstable because one thing, this income inequality, another thing is the lack of social security, social safety net. So they kind of think that I have to take care of myself until I die. Okay. And that deters the consolidation of democracy in everyday lives a lot. Okay. I think that's the relationship between those two.
Okay, maybe from that side, the lady at the back, please.
Hello, I'm Yeon Choi. I'm doing internship in the J Bank right now, and actually, I was a university student at that time exactly. So I participated that protest few times, and actually, it was fine at first. But after 3 months later, like the more I went there, the less I could see the result, and the less I could be sure. Actually, so like. That made me frustrated. Like I cannot see any like clear future at that time. So maybe I think other people can get some suspicious or the wonder about the result. So my question is like, as a political scientist, which make people could continue to protest with that kinds of suspicious or the wondering?
잘 안 들려. 그지? 뭐라고 그랬던 거지?
So to rephrase your question, so are you asking whether you weren't able to see clear results as a result of this Candlelight movement, or?
I mean, like, I was not sure like this kinds of protests will effective to the future or change the government.
Okay.
Or like how they continue to protest with the kinds of wondering.
캔들라이트 무브가 앞으로 정책이나 이런 정부에 영향을 미치네요.
어떤 변화를 가지고 올 수 있는.
I think it will bring a big change in the government. During the Park Geun-hye administration, the problem was communication between the people and the government, lack of communication. So this Moon Jae-in government, as soon as they launched, they had communication 국민청원실 at the Blue House. They set up a
So they set online petition system on their Blue House website, so that people can address their issues, whatever issues that they have forward.
Mm-hmm. They have to. That means they have to respond to the people's, need. So I think it does influence to the government policies or whatever in politics. And also political parties and politicians are very keen to what is their voters' 요구가 뭐지?
Demand.
What is their voters' demand?
Hello, I'm Jiwon Kim from Asan Institute. I'm working in Atlantic Council now. As one of the participants in Candlelight Movement there, I have witnessed many young and old Koreans gather together to achieve the same goal, which is impeachment. But at the same time, I've seen that many kind of hatred. For example, like there was a pro-Park Geun-hye, which is 태극기 부대 in Korean, criticizing the Candlelight Movement, and there was also misogyny argument criticizing Choi Soon-sil and Park Geun-hye, saying that because the president is woman, our nation situation is like this. So after, even though the time passed after that movement, I don't think that those kind of hatred problem in South Korea is not kind of solving. For example, there is still a misogyny problem in South Korea and hatred toward between the poor and the rich and many political parties. So I don't think it is a good and healthy democracy in South Korea. So how can we make a good use of this Candlelight Movement to the future South Korea democracy? Thank you.
Candlelight Movement, they cannot solve everything at once. So one by one, we have to solve it out. And there are big conflicts inside Korea, not only between North and South, even in South, according to by the region. Honam area is much preferred to 민주당, Democratic parties, and Yeongnam is more preferred to the 한국 자유당. Something are very much divided by region. That is a very keen conflict first. And then also there is a very deep conflict between the generation maybe, and the wealthy and then the poor, and then the labor and then user. So there are so many. I know that. I don't think it's the only phenomena in Korea. It's all around the world. Every country has a similar situation. If we solve everything, in equal and very honest and very nicely, it will be good. But it's not easy, really. We need time to. And also, especially the gender and the hatred is very it's getting tough in some sense. I think Dr. Lee Jin-ok will talk about it. It's getting tough after the Me Too movement. So that also we have to solve.
Well, yes, there's something I can briefly add to Dr. Song's explanation. Yeah, like she said, no, the Candlelight Movement cannot solve everything at once. And as far as the Candlelight Movement was concerned, those hate speeches was not an important part of it, although it was a small part of it, but it was not dominant. But it is also true that after the inauguration of Moon Jae-in government, this problem of hatred is becoming very big in Korea. That's true as well. And why is there such hatred growing? There's one interesting explanation by a Harvard economist whose name is Edward Glaser. And he came up with this supply-demand kind of explanation for hatred. Why is hatred supplied? Hatred is supplied by politicians who wanting to criticize their political opponents, and rather than having a direct debate, they spread hatred about people who will benefit from the opposing party's policies. Okay? So these people suddenly become victims of hatred. That's how hatred is supplied. And why is it accepted? Because these voters, ordinary people, they don't have any incentives to try to find what the truth is. So the acceptance comes not from truth, but from this repeated claim. So that is actually what's happening in Korea. Although that doesn't explain everything, that explains an important part of it. For example, there was in the 자유한국당, Liberal Korea Party, which is the main conservative opposing party. There was an election going on that was ended yesterday. And these candidates, very famous politicians, they even argued that during the 1980 Gwangju democratization movement, there were North Korean troops dispatched from North Korea. That rumor really came out of the mouth of the well-known National Assemblyman. That's how hatred is supplied. So I wanted to add that part.
Well, high information society has another trouble and another byproduct, because there are so many fake news. So it's not easy to see which one is fake or not. The fake news make the things worse. So I don't know how to solve that kind of problem. The fake news, more you hate, gender, men and women are not enemy at all, but they make in that way. They draw in that way. So it's not what we want, but things going on in different direction. So always the good things has two different faces. The high technology is not always good, for development. Sometimes a lot of big problems.
Okay, so I know you have many questions to ask, but due to interest of time, I think we need to end here. So please join me in thanking our speakers.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kim, for moderating the session. I know our hands are out, But I hope you stay around after the next session so that you have a chance to actually talk to some speakers over lunchtime. But I was impressed to see some of the data analysis to help us understand how the democracy movement changed, but also not achieve certain things. Now, I was going to mention that 1 month ago, I tend to follow a lot of democracy issues in Africa personally. As I was following different tweets on what's happening in Nigerian election. One of the Nigerian young women posted the picture of Candlelight Movement, saying, 2 years ago, we saw this. Can we see something like this in Nigeria today, leading up to the election? Basically calling for peaceful power transition. So I think people around the world are getting some inspiration from what happened in Candlelight, despite challenges that we just talked about. So next session, we'll be focusing on that. How can experience in South Korea, not just the Candlelight Movement, but going back to the 80s, be the inspiration for other democratic countries, other countries in Asia and beyond, and see how South Korea can help to support such progresses. So I'd like to invite the speakers here. We have 3 speakers, Professor Kim, Dr. Lee, and Ichao Spraidi. And they will be coming here to the stage with a PowerPoint presentation. And my colleague, Lin Lee, would moderate the discussion after the presentation. So, Professor Kim, please come up. This is it. It's okay.
Okay, so can you hear me? All right. My name is Tae Kim, and then my mission is to explain some positive contribution which could be done by the South Korean democracy as its impact on, I think, Korean Peninsula as well as beyond the Korea. Into the Asia or the other places. I think that personally, I'm going to give the wholehearted thanks to NED and KF, Korean Foundation. And also I think it's very meaningful event because I was in the Wilson Center as fellow the last year for 1 year. But all the events related to South Korea is dominated by North Korea and nuclear something. But today is quite a different, I think, topic. That's democracy, South Korea, and how South Korea share its positive experiences or know-how for democratization with the other states, especially developing countries. So I have only 10 minutes, so I will just briefly explain what I prepared today. So name is the Korean wave of democracy. I think you guys know the Korean pop and drama and movies, so-called the Hallyu, the Korean wave. But today I will, a little bit change the contents of Korean wave. There's a democracy. It could be a part of South Korean, the cultural industry, or other, the foreign policy related to the democracy into the other countries. Okay. Right, the introduction. I think the very famous, well-known book, that's the Third Wave, written by the Samuel Huntington, the former Harvard University professor. He just mentioned 3 different types of the democratization, the waves. So first wave, second, third wave. I think right after that, is there any success story, success case to spread out the one democracy into the other? So I think that we can just point out the Jasmine Revolution back in 2011, and then the ousting of a long-time dictator Ben Ali in Tunisia, and then it spread out like domino effect to the other places in Northern Africa and the Middle East. And then even China got some good impact from the Jasmine Revolution at the almost same year, right? I think 1 month later of the Tunisian revolution, that is the Chinese pro-democracy protest, but it's failed. And then the second wave we can just witness, that's the 2014, 3 years later. That's the first one is the sunflower movement in Taiwan. So there is the big momentum to the protest against government policy, especially trade agreement with mainland China and Taiwan. But it's failed also. But it gives some kind of impact on another revolution. I mean, that is the Yellow Umbrella Revolution movement in Hong Kong, but different issues. But still, we have some review analysis. I mean, it is successful or it is a failure case. But still, the majority just agree that two major events in the Hong Kong and Taiwan is failed. So I think exactly 3 years later, we have the South Korean case. That's Candlelight. But I'm not going to the detailed analysis because all two, Korean experts, the first panel, they already described the very detailed process and the contents of the movement. So I think that I'm there to say Candlelight Movement or Revolution 2016 to 2017 is a success story. We changed the impeachment and changed the regime. And then, of course, we have some kind of struggle, especially pro-Park Geun-hye or pro-Moon Jae-in still existing. And then there are some big kind of struggle. But still, we can say Candlelight Movement is quite a success story, and then we can just sell or advertise the Korean Candlelight Revolution as one of, I think, the good experience we just shared through the back in 2 years, 2016 to 2017 with the other countries. So this is the main contents, especially the Korean wave of democracy. I would describe the Korean wave of democracy by using 3 different dimensions. The first one, the global dimension, how South Korean government and civil society organization, they maximize the global agenda or the global stage, like international conferences, as their kind of good momentum or the instrument to spread out, to share the South Korean democratic experiences with other countries. And second is peace dimension, and third is ODA. I think everyone familiar with the ODA, Official Development Assistance, that's the part of the public money from the rich country, the donor country, into some poor countries in the global south. So I will get back later. So the global dimension, I think the well-known example of Korean wave of democracy, especially at the dimension of the globalization or global gathering. The first one, I think the South Korean government successfully hosted the international conferences. It's kind of series of international conferences back in 2011 or 12 and then beyond. So the famous one is always the Busan High-Level Forum 4 on aid effectiveness. This is at the OECD hosting conference, but the OECD asked the South Korean government back in 2011 to host this event. Why? South Korea is the first country changing status from the recipient country to donor. So South Korean government has kind of double edge. Dealing with the South-South cooperation, like the developing countries, and as well as the North-South cooperation, the traditional pattern of the ODA transfer from the rich to the poor. So we accepted, and then he just made us a good result of the Busan Forum. This is actually the last forum, the High-Level Forum on Aid Effectiveness, organized by OECD. And then that's the main mission is toast to the UN General Assembly, especially Sustainable Development Goals. So South Korea contributed a lot in the sense that we just declared the Busan outcome document, including we need more the mutual accountability between the developing countries and developed countries, and then the transparency and the more ownership should be given to the developing countries, and so on. And the second thing is, I think the World Movement for Democracy Global Assembly in 2015, it got organized by the NED and other the sponsors. And then I think the second point I would like to highlight here, as one of global dimension, that's the advancing SDG 16 as global norm of democracy. So I have to explain what is the SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, and how many goals, 17 different goals, and 169 targets, and the 230 something, the global indicator. That's kind of the good evidences of human beings as well as the human society organized by UN back in 2015. So UN just declared the SDG as the common goal for until 2030. But the number of 16, the contents of the goal 16 is the peace, justice, and rule of law, and accountability. The South Korean government just adopted that goal as a main the mission of South Korea. We can contribute in the sense of justice and rule of law and democracy. So South Korean government now is one of the members to organize SDG 16 or SDG 16 plus as the cross-cutting issues to cover up all different SDGs. And second dimension is peace dimension. I think you know the Pyeongchang Olympics last year, and then there is the good momentum for both, North and South Korea. Even the Mike Pence attended. So there is the very important platform for South and North Korea to make the summit, as well as the U.S. and the North Korea. And today they just met together again in Vietnam. So after 1 year, so the Korean civil society organizations and also the Korean government, they just utilized the Pyeongchang Olympics as the kind of another platform to figure out how we can contribute more peaceful negotiations as well as peaceful the solution for democracy and the development for all countries. So they just made it the international conference. The name is Pyeongchang Global Peace Forum 2019, back in the January. So they talk about a lot. I think each are already, you also attended, right? No, okay. So you just invited the many activities or the academia from the civil society organizations in the recipient countries and the other, South Korean area. So we talk about how we can make some nexus between peace and development. So we have to guarantee peace in order to boost up the economic development, vice versa. So economic development should be guaranteed by peace formation. So how we can just deal with both is a very important value together. So the Peace Development Nexus, that's a very important title for the Pyeongchang Peace Forum. And then there is another, I think, good direction, how South Korean government prepared the, aid or the economic support, the economic cooperation with North Korea after the sanction, eased. So that's kind of next step. We just prepare how to combine the peace and development by using the global, the dimension, as well as the peace dimension. And then the last one is UNDP World Bank last year, the April, in this city, the DC. They just sit together and talk about the three different value could be combined. That's the humanitarian assistance, development, and peace nexus. That is the World Bank and UNDP is the common goal, and there are a big contribution made by them. So South Korean government proactively, we try to accept this kind of triple nexus into our existing nexus, the development peace. So that is, I think, the momentum, another move of South Korea government and civil society to see, what happened in the Korean Peninsula by using peace dimension, and also we're going to explain the peace dimension could be very important, the factor of the democratization and then the aiding, promoting the democracy abroad. And last one, the ODA dimension. So generally speaking, we have three different types of the ODA support for so-called the democracy. So the first one is the media support, and second is the governance reform, and then third one, electoral system reform by using South Korean public money, ODA. I'm not going to go into detail one by one, but there are a lot of different cases, but all of them is flagships. So we're just beginning. We're just beginning how we can just demobilize ODA in order to boost up the democratization or democracy support for the recipient countries. So the first one, the media support, you can imagine, you can remember the earthquake in Nepal. So South Korean government, especially KOICA just made a plan to construct radio station in the area where the earthquake severely affected the local people. So local people need information, how to evacuate, how to prepare the earthquake. So Korean KOICA just contribute to make some the program through the construction of the radio station and the main spots of the earthquake in Nepal. And the second case is governance reform. Mostly, KOICA has the plan for supporting the police, education to police, how to reduce the corruption of policemen in recipient countries, especially Vietnam and Ethiopia. And the last one, electoral system. I think also the Dr. Son involved in the support for how to support the electoral the process in recipient countries. So more transparency, more equal votes. So we just dispatch some of the experts to the local area to see the election process could be transparent. And the last one, very briefly, the current government, Moon Jae-in government, so-called the New South policy. We have the main diplomatic focal point is always given to U.S., Japan, and Russia, and China. So Moon Jae-in government now try to upgrade. So another countries such as ASEAN or the India make Global South as a main partner for the foreign policy and diplomatic relations. So they set up the New South policy, and under the New South policy, we have the main target of New South policy, that's ASEAN countries. So ODA, as I said, the KOICA is the major agency in disbursing the ODA in the form of grant. So it's a part of the government agencies. So KOICA policy should be aligned with the New South policy, and they now the increased budget for the New South policy program, so which could be targeted to ASEAN countries. So if you see the bottom, new government, New South policy, we have the three major values of the New South policy. That's peace, people, prosperity. So peace is part of the big three P's of the Moon's government, especially New South policy. And then we can see the connection between the peace component of the New South policy and each different, the targeted, the very the micro level of the policy makings. So ASEAN, in the case of the left side, promoting democratic governance ASEAN. So all the ODA program under the New South policy, we have to focus on how to develop the governance more accountable and more transparent. So there are some kind of policy alignment and coordination between the government policies and the ODA policies. They are all focused on how to share the experiences of democracy with the other countries. But I have to emphasize some caveats. So far, I'm just highlight some the very positive aspect of South Korean experiences. But we have to remember the dark side as well. So first of all, democracy cannot be exported. It must be grown from within. So we can support them, but the solution mechanism should be developed and designed by the local people. So I think the democracy cannot be exported and imported. So this Korean way or Korean wave is not the solution, but it's kind of platform where we can support and they can receive some money to develop their own way of democracy. So popular support, the participation are the prerequisite ingredient for democracy. Of course, that's true. And then the last one, popular support should not lead to populism, but create the strength of the republicanism. So populism or republicanism, I don't know how we can draw the line. This is populism, this is not. But if we didn't think of what is the main impact of our money or the ODA into the local area, major result could be populism, populist approach, destroy all the institutions. That will be harmful. So they're very careful to figure out what is the Korean wave, what is the positive impact of South Korean experiences into the local communities. So that's not the final comment through the whole the Korean wave of democracy today. Right, so I will stop here. Thank you.
this meant to be conclusion. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for having me here in this wonderful opportunity. Actually, this is really interesting. Yeah, thank you. Is it right? Yeah, this is really interesting venue. I was asked to present of Korean civil society experience to make a candlelight visuals because I'm a director or president of the organization which is called Korea Women's Political Solidarity, but actually it is Gender 정치 연구소 여세연 in Korean. So basically our organization is a research institute, but at the same time we are doing some activism. So today's discussion is very much academic, so it's just so fascinating to be engaged in such discussion. But here, because I am supposed to talk on behalf of Korea's civil society, I would like to say something of democracy as such a normative value rather than what actually are. And, you know, Korea's ODA spending some money on electoral system reform. I wish Korea does do it to Korea's electoral reform, which we are focusing on so desperately. But anyway, so my presentation today is about the aesthetics of politics. When I'm saying of aesthetics of politics, it doesn't mean that politics is beautiful all the time. Aesthetics lies in the nature to change something very ugly, and we find some beauty in it. And I think Candlelight Visuals has made some beauty out of it. I have prepared my note, so I will focus on reading it because too much. So I need to make compact, and I can't really speak so fast. First of all, again, I would like to thank you for having me in DC on the very historical day. It is such an honor and delight for me to be here to tell you how closely connected we are across continents, particularly #MeToo campaigns that began here in the United States have encouraged many Korean women to speak out, making a tipping point in the long-standing, strong Korean feminist movement. We are living in the same era, getting a time lag less and less. So as you have proposed, the experience and past that South Korea has been going through would be transmitted to other political entities by any means sooner or later. Then I would like to emphasize the role of the global civil society in making good representation. It is because politics is the art of making impossible possible, and the institutional design for good representation will certainly enhance the performance of politics better. The impeachment of President Park was a defining moment of good performance of politics, demonstrating the aesthetics of politics. Of course, it was the candlelight visuals, as many have already explained in this venue, that had led to the impeachment of the President Park. However, we needed to recall that the impeachment was done through the 2 consecutive democratic procedures of casting votes in constitutional institutions, i.e., the National Assembly, and the other, the Constitutional Court. This means that the candlelight visuals generated a massive energy to uplift citizens' spirit for democracy, but also to restore
the institutional foundation for democracy. The decision-making to endorse the impeachment in the National Assembly and Constitutional Court was the very aesthetic moment that institutional rituals embody evolutionary, transgressive, and disruptive change. The roles that South Korean civil society has been playing in this transition towards democracy can be encapsulated in three ways. Firstly, the candlelight vigils, which took place 23 times in Gwanghwamun Plaza, were not only an agora for political speeches and discussions, but also an arena for cultural events. And such a platform was created by inexplicable hard work and dedication of individual activists in civil movement groups. The collective action to step down Park was a united association to which about 2,300 civil movement groups were affiliated. We can say that the accumulated experiences, knowledge, wisdom, and trust built in South Korean civil society over 3 decades since 1980s led to steady, orderly, and peaceful demonstrations in combination with the concerted efforts and converging enthusiasm of every participant. Secondly, I have to mention that, as one of the participants raised the question, feminists had to fight for double causes. One is to step down the President Park, and the other to denounce the misogynist discourse that was prevalent in the plaza. The symbolic representation of the President Park Geun-hye's gender, which is a woman, we cannot really say she was simply the daughter of Park Chung-hee, I would argue, has been met with deeply rooted misogyny in the political arena. Feminist political rising was witnessed even before the candlelight vigils. The picture, which I have just shown you now, is the Gangnam-yeok, the women's, the feminists would argue that that was femicide on the 17th of May in 2016, which was before the candlelight vigils, and that was the moment, that was the very significant moment of the gender, the event. However, the waves of feminist movement, such as campaigns against the violence on women, campaigns for the sexual and reproductive rights of women, and against spy camp porn, and ongoing Me Too campaigns. It was started by one of the prosecutors against the prosecutor, and it moved to many prominent Korean leaders in every area of society, and it is still going on quite vigorously. And I would argue that these feminist movements continue to carry out the candlelight vigil's transformative energy, challenging the fundamental power relations and structural dominance in South Korea's everyday lives. This means that feminism for perfect democracy in a way in which democracy cannot come true in theory or words, but in praxis and deeds. Feminist movement in South Korea, like elsewhere in the world, tell us that we need to cultivate and embody the norms of democracy, which requires to challenge the male bias dominant norm of winner takes all or survival of the fittest, but rather to perform the ethics of equality and respect to every single being on earth. Thirdly, the culture of equality cannot be cultivated without the institutional design for equality. That is a major activism that my organization is at the moment engaged in. And what we are arguing is that the norms of democracy would go in vain without the institutional design for democratic politics. South Korea has mixed member majoritarian, which is MMM, electoral system, which is the most common in East Asia. MMM is seen as a voting system that is essentially power concentrating. As the proportional representation or apportionment is even less than 1/5 in the National Assembly, it hardly challenges the plurality system in SMDs that heavily favors the dominant party, therefore maintaining two-party system and preventing small parties from entering the assembly. In order to complete the candlelight vigils as a revolutionary force, it is essential to shift the electoral system the way to increase proportionality and diversity of representation and make constitutional reforms for more inclusive society. That is what Professor Chang, who just mentioned about the accountability, the way the Korean politics, which is just stuck all the time and overpowered Blue House. So civil society at the moment is pulling all the power to change this. So in this sense, those civil society, civil organizations, and the key activists that have played the critical role in setting up the candlelight vigils in 2016 to 17, including my organization. My organization didn't really do much of the setting up of candlelight vigils, though, are now pulling all kinds of available resources and harnessing our strengths to reform the electoral system. If great transformations are made, political parties would be more accountable and responsive to citizens' claims and needs, and the National Assembly would have better representation of diverse groups, such as women, youth, workers, the deprived, sexual, and ethnic minorities. This means that we, South Koreans, are still trying to make the aesthetics of politics embedded in the presentive system. I would say it is too early yet for us to export our democracy to other world. Once South Korea has made a successful transition towards better electoral and political system to institutionalize democracy, then I can affirm that South Korea become a more robust leader to defend and promote democracy in the Asian region and beyond at a time that there is a major vacuum of traditional democratic leadership. And the presence and the representation of women in the political arena will enable us to measure the progress that South Korea is making for a while. I hope that in the near future, we can say that South Korea has made it. We've made a turning point in the electoral system and also a peace treaty with North Korea, completing the journey of revolutionary time. I really wish. Thank you very much.
First, I would like to thank NED, WMD, and Korea Foundation to invite me here to deliver civil society perspective on South Korea's roles in leading a robust democracy in Asia. First, I've joined the movement in 1998. Nobody knows about what happened during the late 1970s of Park Chung-hee. Nobody knows about Marcos, but Indonesia, who had under authoritarianism for 32 years, finally we're learning from exchange. Slowly we understand if our rights have been abused, and since then there is a growing movement in Indonesia because of we're learning from non-frail movements that able to motivating people power in Manila and then finally able to ousted Marcos. That simple, small things I learned from small discussion on the ground behind the campus, and then I learned from leaflets that been photocopied or stencil machines that always we had under our bed, because we hiding from the police and military searchings. That's simple. People moving, learning, and then gatherings, consolidating, and finally becoming the wave of 1998 student uprisings, where I was part of it together with millions of students in Indonesia. I believe what we learned from Candlelight Revolution, it means some things that we should preserve, that we should continue to tell the people. If not motivating us right now, maybe we're motivating the next generation of Democrats advocates. So my role here is actually to comment things, the success story of democracy and the Korean roles in promoting democracy, and also putting some suggestion what actually the civil society in Asia looking from the Koreas in the future roles. Korea have everything, as we saw, able to, well, I describe in here in the very small triangles, arrows, lead and inspire democracy, empower, facilitate, that we hope keep motivating. Many countries, many activists every year goes to Korea. We learn about Gwangju, we learn about Candlelight, and so many movements in the countries. And then they bring the homes, they try to keep continue, they keep rolling up the movement, and every year that we expecting Korea to have more of these kind of things. We saw the Korea strategically and efficiently utilize various diplomatic channels and international engagements, trades, ODA, engagement in different international platforms like Community of Democracy, OGP, G20, SDG 16, like my friends, Professor Kim has mentioned. Actually, I should not repeat it, but then again, I think it's very important for Korean to listen what the Asian Democracy Network view about the successful of your countries. We saw the Korean can be moving toward the champion of the democracy that can progress as a middle power in the coming futures. Unfortunately, there's not much country in Asia like Korea. There's very less initiative we saw from the neighboring country. That will bring us to the next, what we're looking for from the Korean in the coming futures. Basically, there's two roles that civil society wanted to see from the Korean government and the Korean civil society. One is to fostering democratic unity, and second is to expanding democratic solidarity efforts. Why so? I think our friend is already highlighted. It's not all about Korea. We need to expanding this to other countries. We have to make effects. So we wanted to see the Korea to fostering more forum or develop allies and democratic champions between the neighboring countries. There's a few potential countries that can be allies of the South Korea. Let's say Indonesia, Malaysia, new emerging democracy. Sri Lanka, although there's a turbulence, but we still see Sri Lanka as have stable democracy. Timor-Leste, India, or maybe other countries who will coming in the next futures to keep engaged with South Korea, build as a democratic allies, to formulate strategic cooperation, bilaterally, or even trilaterally and multilaterally. If not states, maybe can be with state agencies. I saw leadership of South Korean within the AWEB, Association of World Electoral Bodies, that able to convene over 120 countries and based in Seoul, Korea. This we wanted to look forward to also happen with the National Human Rights Commission, for instance. Make coalition strategic in the anti-corruption. if we cannot go in the state because of the diplomatic problem, we can also embrace the state agency or state department to cooperate each other. Democratic consolidation of civil society. South Korea already proven for the almost last 10 years, I'm witnessing people coming and go and learning and inspired from South Korea. We also wanted to see South Korea developing more research and knowledge exchange, not only about Korea, but also promoting exchange between the country in Asia. The second thing that civil society in Asia wanted to see is democratic solidarity. Korea has been using the trades, using ODA or using many other tools and international platform. But we wanted to see South Korea expanding more to make interventions, quote unquote, in different meanings, to intervene countries under suppression and with democratic concerns. My organization for the 2019 and 2020, we're going to focus to do something in Bangladesh, India, Thailand, Myanmar, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, and many other countries who are all known now under the democracy suppressions. So we hope that South Korea can join. Some of concrete action to inspiring democracy in Asia. This is some things that we actually circulate and we get some input from our members. Try to highlight investment and democracy. I guess there is some things behind this sentence. I'm very hard to find this sentence to softening the meanings. In many Asian countries, there's a growing investment that without considerations of many things, without consideration of human rights, consideration of environments, even consideration of the local values. South Korea can start or even continue to implement positive investment policies, promote guidelines and tools to the Korean investment, Korean company, and even try to sensitizing the local civil society about what is the positive investments, with using human rights-based approach to ODA and business practices. Let me cite one quite a very simple example. If you're asking right now NGO in Indonesia, how big of the Chinese investment in Indonesia, I think nobody can answer for two reasons. Either they don't know the information or simply they don't want to pose as oppositions of the current governments. Secondly, all the investment they're doing, they're normally taking all resources, including the human resources, laborers, coming from the home countries. So we have investment, we're watching the developments, but nobody involved, no local involved, and all been taken by the contractors. I think this is a good time for South Korea or any other effort to really introduce, really empowers and makes participation of the local CSO to engage, to monitor, and also to criticizing the government policy on investments. Next is about cyber democracy. Everybody complaining about social media has been more dominated by, let's say, the bad guys, because the good guy doesn't want to really use it. Many civil societies not be able or doesn't have capacity to really using the cyber in order to enhancing the campaigns. So taking the strength as a leader of technology and innovation, everybody knows how capable South Koreans in terms of technology. So the civil society in Asia really look forward the South Korean to raise the public consciousness and engagement on media and technology. In another way, the cyber democracy also can educate peoples to increase participation in order to monitor government accountability and transparency. Next is local democracy or local governments. So local government right now is in the front lines of the practice of democracy. I saw a few years ago, Gwangju human rights cities, maybe 5 years ago. But then again, last year, I witnessed how actually the local government harvesting from what they're learning from Gwangju Human Rights Cities. Last year in Wonosobo, Indonesia, I really witnessing how the local government, in cooperation with the National Human Rights Commissions, plus civil society, they established what they call National Human Rights Festival. I really witnessed how vibrant the local society can criticizing directly to the local government providing space and platform for the people to talk, and through cultural and art performance, the message of democracy and transparency of government has been delivered. So I guess this is some things that we have to enhance more to continue promote good governance and democratic principle through local governments. If central government is too complicated, then we can go directly to the local governments. Don't forget, local government also being target of the bad investment. Next is democracy education support. From early morning, we heard about how disengaged the youths on the politics affairs. In only some case, the youths really care about political affair. I think one of the factors is because there is no adequate democratic education supports. Even in my home countries, you will not learn about democracy until you're in the high school. So I think the South Korea can push more about supporting effort to cultivate next generation democracy leaders. You can sharing what Korea experience, but also can expanding to the tools, guidelines on democracy education that can motivating others. And then, of course, supporting various platforms to connect democracy education stakeholders. It's not only about the youths, but this democracy education should also reach those unreachable, and then should include those excluded. Many, even in our generation, even in the more senior generation, they still not really get proper information about democracy. Promoting peace and inclusiveness. Of course, Pyongyang has been mentioned early, but South Korea can take role to display this process as not only as a model, because this year we have at least 2 peace process parallelly happening. First in, of course, the North Korea Peninsula, and also maybe in the corner of the Philippines with autonomous regional Muslim Mindanao. Both progressing the same, only different process. I think this can be one of the study case that we can enlarge as maybe as a sample or as a model in different approach. And then last is promoting democratic consolidation. In here, I wrote we need a periodic event to consolidate the CSO, states and other actors in national and regional levels. I was surprised when I go back to my home country, Indonesia, and then I try to discuss with them and tell them about the agenda. Unfortunately, they don't have. And then I fly again under the Himalaya mountains. I saw the Nepal, who are under, approach of the 2 giant countries, India and China. They also equally say, we don't have national agenda of civil society. Well, if you're asking me, ADN in regional level, I think I have a shadow agenda. But this agenda may be reflecting only regional organization perspective rather than reflecting national organization perspective. So I guess in the coming future, we're looking forward Korea also to pursue these national and regional consolidations. Thank you. For those who are still doesn't know ADN, I think I have some leaflet in here. We are actually network of network. We have 9 regional networks with over 300 national organizations. We just new 6 years established with one goal: to promote and defend democracy together. I have to stop from that point, and then looking forward to receiving any further communication. Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Lynn Lee, and I'm an Associate Director for Asia here at the National Endowment for Democracy. We only have 20 minutes. I know you've been all sitting here for the last 2.5 hours. You're very tired and hungry. So I'm going to skip my questions, even though I have many, many questions. I do want to say, though, that I've been traveling to Seoul at least 2 to 3 times a year for my work at the Endowment, and I thought I really understood South Korean politics, but today I've learned so much from the first panel as well as during this panel. So I'm sure you all feel the same way and you have a lot of questions, so I want to give you an opportunity to spend the next 20 minutes to have this discussion with our 3 panelists. So due to the limited time, I'm going to collect 2 to 3 questions each time, and I'll give the 3 panelists an opportunity to answer. Okay, at the back.
Thank you. Russell Shell with the Global Taiwan Institute.
It's not on.
Is this on now?
Yes.
Okay, Russell Shell with the Global Taiwan Institute. I think all the speakers made a very compelling case for why it's important for South Korea to promote democracy and what South Korea has to offer. And I wonder if the panelists from Korea could also share with us their insights on what do Korean people think? Do Korean people feel like it's necessary to promote democracy? Is there support for promotion of democracy abroad, outside of Korea, in South Korea? And related to that also is, it seems to me that we've sort of avoided one of the biggest questions in the room, which is the impact of the rise of authoritarian countries and its impact on democracies in the region. And so I suppose for the Korean panelists as well as the other gentleman from ADNA is what are the views of Koreans and Asian Democrats towards the impact that China's rise have on democratization, or the exporting of its authoritarian model for democratization in the Asian region. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? So the gentleman here and there.
Hi, good morning. I'm originally from Japan and a naturalized U.S. citizen. I'm an author of a book, The Prospects for a Regional Human Rights Mechanism in East Asia. Now, at this time, I just would like to say the following. I am not one of those Japanese people who support right-wing nationalist Abe Shinzo-led Japanese government who cannot see history squarely and evade historical responsibility, especially with regard to what we call comfort women issue, in consideration on particularly what Germany has done since the end of World War II. Japanese tend to think that they belong to the West. That's absolutely wrong. Japan is a part of Asia. I really hoping that leaders emerge in Japan who can construct, establish, create genuinely friendly relations with neighboring countries such as Korea and China. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Due to the, because we have very little time, please keep your questions short and please make sure you're asking questions. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Haley from Center for International Private Enterprise, and I am a student that is very much interested in civil society and international development. And I know that COICA and other organizations are offering programs for young professionals very much, but I don't feel that these programs are leading to actually growing the professionals in Korea in terms of international development. And do you think there are more efforts that COICA or other government organizations can do to make sure that there are enough professionals in Korea? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, would you like to start?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Can you hear me, right? Thank you for all the good questions, comments. Let me my tag should be very brief because we don't have enough time. So I think the first question is the South Korean democracy is quite qualified item to be exported. As I emphasized, the democracy or democracy aid is not an item to be exported or imported. So just kind of item how to support their own process. So those processes should be designed and implemented by local people. So South Korea, I think in terms of democracy aid, we can contribute our experiences. Just explain that. So I think the Icha already mentioned the maybe democracy education process we can provide. So we can share our own experiences. That's it. Because this is sometimes sovereignty issue, and then the definition of democracy always are differently made by the local people. So the one type of democracy cannot be, I think, standardized. So that's why I'm very careful, especially in terms of the democracy, promoting democracy through the aid. And also the China rise and the China, effects, especially in terms of democracy. I don't know how to judge the Chinese way of democratization could be, seen as one of the major factors for South Korean, the ODA policy for the promotion of the democracy. But we have to calculate the OBOR, one belt, one road policies, and its impact on the local, I think, the area, especially economic development, and then some political modernization. And then we can just select some I think the bad or the good impact of China factor in terms of political, I think, the modernization, which could be related to the South Korean policy for the democracy abroad. And the second question, especially the young lady raised the question, the World Friend Korea, that's the young professional program. Now, conducted by the KOICA, we can select some of the young, the volunteers to support the some KOICA program or project in abroad, especially developed countries. And absolutely, you're right. So I cannot agree. Without mention, Korean government now review the whole young professional program, which have been done by the South Korean government before. The Park Geun-hye and even the current government. So they now try to figure out how we can develop and renovate, young program and young professional program, such as the enabling environment should be firstly reform, which means the business sector or the conglomerates or the private company, they have to receive some of the demands from the young professionals after this award in the French program, Korea program, because the connection between the job opportunity right after the young professionals. So one of the biggest plan of South Korean Moon Jae-in government, KOICA, 20,000 young professionals could be getting job, decent work, decent job after this program. So that's the new information I can give it to you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Sure.
I do have a lot to say, so I will try to keep it short as much as I can. But firstly, because Professor Kim is in charge of KOICA program, so I think things can change, hopefully. Yeah?
Very duly appointed.
Good change.
Yeah.
Yeah, good change. There are many, but firstly, I'd like to just remind you of the title I have chosen, Making an Architecture for Good Representation in Rebuilding Democracy. I think it is a very much important moment of South Korea, but also North Korea, basically Korean Peninsula and the regional politics. When we are talking about aesthetical approach to politics and democracy, it is that actually nothing really changed in our lives. People still are kind of living out of misery, and my income hasn't increased at all, and then my kids, causing troubles. However, we really need to have hope. We really need to have something to attach it to the world, make the meanings. That is what humans do. But then the Japanese author just mentioned about the comfort women. The stories, the talk we just have make us feel connected. And then we create the stories out of it. That is what the aesthetic nature of politics. But then what South Korea is having at the moment is that we are having the first 100th anniversary of the first of March movement in 1919.
And I think it is so important for us to revive that the historical moment. It is because there is a prehistory before South and North Korea divided. And that is about the Japanese domination, but also it is kind of the first time for us to try to imagine what the Korea should look like after the Japanese domination ends. So then that was the equality and the utilitarian society, not going back to the past like the monarchy to have a king or kingdom. So then we really need to sort of like recreate all the stories of such, the Republican society, and then this is the moment for us to rebuild the democracy. But then we really need to have some stories about what kind of future we want to have together. But then if we just go back to the question of about the political efficacy, I don't really feel that nothing is really changing. Why should I just keep going to the protests, or why should I get interested in politics? Yes, it is right. It doesn't really change anything. But then what can we do? But then what is really interesting statistics about such political efficacy and its relationship with political participation. For instance, feminists are the group who has the lowest level of political trust. But they do make more political participation. So what it means is that there isn't really kind of close relationship between political efficacy and political participation, because we do not really trust it, because we think it's really ugly, so we are doing something. And I think that is what is happening in the United States as well. So that's one thing which I wanted to say. And the teachers' union, yes, it is still outlawed now and so teachers are trying to sort of like make the the change in the regulations about teachers union. But what we really need to focus is that the school itself is completely depoliticized. Not only teachers but students. Students do not have any right to talk about their political opinions. And the school movement, the Me Too campaigns are taking place in every high school, and then nothing really changes. So I think when we are talking about the teachers' union, we really need to look at what the students is facing up with. I think South Korea really needs to have a revolutionary time in school more than in the National Assembly. If we just see how many hours the students have to sit in the school and in hagwons and everything. The last thing which I want to mention about is that the Park Geun-hye was a woman, and more women voted for Park Geun-hye. That is true. And then if we just look at it, counting the votes, it was women, particularly in their 50s and 60s, who voted for Park Geun-hye. But what is important is that they are mostly the swing vote group. So the result which we can interpret is that they have voted for Park Geun-hye because she is simply a woman. And then they wanted to see that women represent the state, the nation state. So then what it says is that there was absence of women's representation in political arena in South Korea. She was the only woman. And actually I do have some more PowerPoint slides which I couldn't really show you, is that I would argue in one of my papers that is South Korea after democracy, what we are witnessing is the re-masculinization of political domain. For instance, in the latest local election, which took place in June in 2018, the Democratic Party has chosen 17 male candidates for 17 provinces. So what it means is that we had one first female president, but we never had any female governors since South Korea was made. We never had anyone. And we have got only 8 female mayors out of 252. This is so important. When I'm saying about how many, where women are, when we are questioning this kind of question, it is the measurement of the democracy. Probably after 40 years, 50 years, if we have more than 40% of women in National Assembly, we can say something else. But now, 17% of women are in the National Assembly. And it doesn't, what it shows that is women are still the tokens. When women are only tokens, they do not speak for women yet. And when they fail to speak for the women, what it means is that democracy is just a word. It doesn't really do anything. So then the politics of aesthetics or ethical approach to politics or democracy really needs to have the gender dimension of symbolic representation. So that's why I wanted to make a focus about why women should be present in the political arena. So that's all I wanted to say. Sorry.
Joe, I know in your presentation you said South Korea is not ready to share democratic experience, but I think your passion and dynamism will certainly inspire others working on women's political participation in Asia and beyond, right?
Yeah.
So please consider that. All right, Icha.
I think two of them already representing all the answer. Then you can save.
Okay.
Pick up another.
Sounds good. Okay. Let's take more questions. We only have 5 more minutes. So we'll start from that corner there, and Yeonho, you're last. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Daniel Revere from the Asan Institute. I'm also interning for the Representative Mike Kelly. I have a question to the leaders of CSOs. There is a current trend in Korea idolizing a certain person or a politician. So I was just wondering, is that good for democracy? And if it's not, what should we do about that? Thank you.
Okay. Danny. Right there. Oh, Danny, behind you. Right there.
Hi, my name's Nicole. I'm at the Una Chapman Cox Foundation, and sort of talking on aesthetics and also this idealization of people. Places like Seoul and Busan or the Hallyu Wave are the faces of Korea internationally. And so I'd be interested to hear your opinions or what's going on the ground in terms of weaving in minorities and rural provinces into the democratization process and having them included in Korean civil society.
Thank you. Yeonho, KEI. Because we're talking about the regional dimension, I'd like to ask about potential spillover of the South Korean democracy to its neighboring country, which is North Korea. My understanding is when it comes to the discussion on North Korea in that aspect, there are 2 groups, one supporting engagement with North Korea and the other raising this human rights abuse issues in North Korea. And it seems to me those 2 groups doesn't really want to get together and have discussions in an honest way. And I don't think that's a very that healthy situation. So how do you think we can close this big gap in South Korea as far as the discussions are concerned? Thank you.
Thank you. So who wants to go first?
I can respond on idolization and then minorities issues. First, maybe about idols. I think idols, or even in some part of the South Asians, we know about we are worshipping the politicians. It's part of the very customary political patronage. If you see in part of India, part of Nepal, and many, even in my own country, people always pick up the idols, especially going for the elections. But they easily swing on the next election when the idol cannot bring or cannot perform the hopes that they expected. But I never expect if South Korea also influenced this idolization, but from the electoral politics per se, it is very normal. Things happen in Asia. But I don't know how the South Korea, maybe you can give later on, but it has happened in many countries in Asia. About minorities, one of the speech when I was standing and delivering my presentation is to reach those unreachable and then try to include those as excluded. I think this is the biggest aim of Asian Democracy Networks. They should be taking part, they should be involved in the movement. Not only in the movement, they're also involved in the politics, they're also involved in many aspects. And then I think this is part of the things, the biggest thing that we have to pursue them. But minorities living in their own, customary things. Some are welcome to be part of the movement. Some is like need to really scrutinizing the values, whether we're going to lose the value if we join the movements, or what kind of benefit that we can obtain from this movement, including that they can obtain from political participations. But I saw recently there's a growing numbers of participants in terms of the political contestations. For example, in Indonesia, I cannot cite others, but in Indonesia, there's a growing consensus and consolidation among the minorities groups. They sign up their name as a member, a candidate of the member parliaments, candidate of the mayors in the next elections. I think this is good progress, and then we need to encouraging them. I mean, just matter of time and just matter of the advocacy, and then push from the civil society, and of course to ensure the government or the policy makers to enlarge the space for them. And then about the spillover, I think I give to the expert from South Korea.
Right. I will take the third question. North Korea, probably civil society thinks Korea.
I mean, no, you can address whichever questions you want, and you can address other questions as well.
I have talked a lot.
So let's make it a 1 minute answer.
Yeah, I really didn't mean to say that long. I was right. I just want to say just only one thing. Idolization of politicians is just so natural, because that is what the politics is about. Politics has such a dimension of performance, like the dancers or the singers, which is sort of like a kind of nature thing. But then I think one problem is that we don't really have strong parties, and like the ODA, Korean ODA is supporting the electoral party, the system reform is because we need to really have institutionalized of the party system, because the parties are very much the source of corruption. So then the building of the party is important, and the populism. In that sense, I'd like to just recommend a book which is published recently. Chantal Mouffe has recently written a book of left populism. So then we really need to kind of revise of the democracy. Democracy also has the kind of sharing the nature of the populism. So we can't really say that is always bad or anything. We really need to understand about the human nature. That's what we think. And North Korea can be, I think, very much challenging, because South Korea is very much divided and very much racist and sexist. So we really need to relearn of the kind of the ethics of living together. So it is not just only the problem of North Korea, but also South Korea itself can be very much challenge as well for democracy. I think.
Thank you.
All right, I will add up the third question in North Korea. It is a very hard topic. So it's my personal view, and I cannot generalize. I mean, this is roadmap how we can just socialize North Korea in terms of human rights. But it takes time. So we have to make some kind of very long-standing, long time to plan, maybe step by step. For example, I already explained the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. Those goals are applied to all countries as UN member countries. So North Korea is one of UN member countries. So North Korea should be reporting how to implement 16 and 17 different goals into the local area, local context. But North Korea doesn't know what is the SDG, how to prepare. So we had a meeting with the North Korean delegates in the Mongolia as well as China and Mongolia. We have met twice. So we tried to explain and educate them how to prepare SDGs. You have to report every 4 years. That is the responsibility of all the UN member countries. But US did not report yet. So I think except US and North Korea did not report yet. Anyway, so that's kind of first step. How do they understand global norms? Because the 16 different goals include gender issues, human rights, democracy, economic growth, everything. So it is the first step to, for North Korean leaders to understand. This is the global norms, and then we have to prepare something. And then probably that is the first step, and then hopefully it is, even though we have the long way to go, but we can start.
On top of that, I'd like to say that NED has been providing such opportunities to have meetings between North and South Korean women to talk about the democracy, also founded by Dr. Son. So then I think such meetings and dialogues in the middle way is going to be always useful in this sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for
losing mind.
No, highlighting a very important project that we're supporting. So on that, we will conclude the second panel. Please join me in thanking all three wonderful panelists. And